Welcome. Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Um, yeah, I'm going to be giving a PowerPoint presentation in a little bit um, uh, to give some background into what went into my thinking while writing the book, but also uh, after writing the book, because I've been giving presentations about it. But I realized, and it kind of came to me a few months ago, I was having breakfast with a former colleague, principal of Abbott Middle School. I taught at Abbott Middle School in San Mateo for 11 years or so. Anyway, she and I are still friends. And we're having breakfast a couple of months ago, and she said, how's it going? How's the book promotion, et cetera? And I was telling you, it's certainly about the book for me because it tells a powerful story, and a story that many people, particularly here in America, who are not Bosnian, don't know. And she said, I said, but I'm really about giving a presentation, helping people understand what happened there, helping people understand that there's universality, that these things can happen, these horrific events can happen anywhere. I mean, to be honest, I have a lot of Bosnian friends and allies who say right now the Russian invasion in Ukraine is re-traumatizing to them. But the principal said to me, I think, Jordan, this is more of your calling than just the book. And it really has become that. I'm part of organizations that advocate for true democracy in Bosnia. I'm in an advisory capacity on a board in upstate New York, Bosnian American Community Association. So I think the point here is that I'll be talking about the book, and I want to inspire you to read the book, but I also want to inspire you to understand what happened leading to the genocide in Bosnia and how it really can happen and does happen anywhere in the world. It's still happening, can happen even here in this country if we're not vigilant. So what I'd like to do first is share the screen, right, Jenna? We can do that. We had a little technical trouble before. Is that okay? Are you able to see the big screen?
Looks perfect. Yeah, big screen.
Excellent. Okay. So, and you'll be able to ask questions. I suppose if you have any questions during the presentation, please send them through the chat, and Jenna can ask me them. It's fine if people, want to ask questions at that moment, or we could wait to the end. It's about 20-minute presentation, and then we'll be talking more about the book, and there'll be a Q&A so we can really get into some conversation. So I titled this Horrors of the Genocide in Bosnia. And I kind of changed the subtitle. At one point, it was Universal Lessons in Rhetoric, Rage, and Resilience, because really, in some sense, that's my book. The characters really suffered as a result of propaganda and rhetoric and hate against people called Bosniaks, and Bosniaks are Bosnian Muslims, but culturally prefer to be referred to as Bosniaks. And because of this propagandist rhetoric, what ensued was genocide. But ultimately, my characters in the book, and I'll talk to you more about how I even got to writing about them, do find a sense of balance. Nobody ever fully heals from the trauma of war. That's just, and I don't know if any of you in the audience either know people or you yourselves have experienced being in war, or being in some sort of military, activity, but nobody ever fully heals. But they can try, and my characters do find a sense of balance, and there is resilience, and I think it's part of our human being human beings that allows us, even through such tragedy, to find hopefully some joy in life, and people I've spoken to have found that, and I'll talk more about that in a sec, but let's go on to the presentation. So this is a map of what Bosnia and Herzegovina looks like today. Some people consider it Eastern Europe, others consider it Central Europe. So whatever you prefer, but as you can see, to the north is Croatia, and this is important, and to the east is Serbia. And if you look in the map, up here is what's called Republika Srpska. So just kind of take note, it says Republika Srpska on the northwestern, and also as you go down, I don't know if you can see, are you able to see my cursor, Jenna, or no?
We can't see it right now,
Okay,
unfortunately.
so then just kind of look for Republika Srpska. It's up in the, like I said, the northwest, actually sort of central northwest, and then down to the southeast. And that is an important area to remember, and I will be talking more about that now, or in just a minute. Okay, so understand that in 1991, the demographics in Bosnia and Herzegovina are as such. So there were 43% of population of the 4.4 million were Bosniaks. Again, those are Bosnian Muslims. 31% Serbs who were Orthodox Christian, 17% Croats who were Catholic, and then there's the others, 9%. I hate to use the term others. In fact, we can get into a little bit later, but right now, today in Bosnia, others consist of people who consider themselves Yugoslav or Jewish or Roma, or don't affiliate with any sort of religion or ethnicity, and they're actually considered not to have the same rights as the three constituent groups that I mentioned here. And again, I've been involved in some advocacy work. I could talk more about that later, but just to know that in 1991, of these 4.4 million, the majority were Bosniaks. Okay. My book focuses on, at least the first half of the book, on the invasion by the Bosnian Serb nationalists who were really fighting for what Serbia, and you saw Serbia to the east, these were ethnic Serbs living in Bosnia. There were ethnic Serbs living in Kosovo, in Croatia, and other places. And at the time, the president of Bosnia, and I'm sorry, of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, was spewing his hate in the form of rhetoric against Muslims. And we all know, and I'll tell you, as a middle school teacher, I taught a unit on Islam to 7th graders. And one of the first questions I'd ask them is, what do you think of when you think of Muslim? And 99% of them said terrorist. So Milosevic was slick enough to be able to he would never refer to Bosnians as Bosnian Muslims as Bosniak. It was always Muslims. And then he would attach labels like extremists and terrorists. And he would say if we don't, we meaning we in Serbia or you ethnic Serbs in these other areas, including Bosnia and Kosovo and Croatia, if you don't stand up, those Muslims are going to rape your wives and steal your daughters and enslave them, and all this really horrific rhetoric. The Bosnian Serbs invaded in 1992 after Croatia, well, let me step back, Croatia and Slovenia, which were republics of Yugoslavia, there were 6 republics. Those 2 countries voted for independence in 1991. Milosevic, who was president of Serbia, was able to, the Yugoslav army had pretty much discharged all the other ethnic groups who had been soldiers, and it was primarily Serbian. Again, this is when Yugoslavia was still a country, a communist country, but it was starting to break apart. And the Yugoslav People's Army was made up primarily of Serbians. So when Croatia and Slovenia voted for independence in 1991, Milosevic sent in the Yugoslav People's Army to really have that, take over and help through aggression, encourage them to not be independent countries. They invaded Slovenia, meaning Yugoslav People's Army under Milosevic's control as president. And that war only lasted 10 days. It wasn't very extensive. Perhaps it wasn't a very strategic location for them to take over. But Croatia, the war lasted for a few years. And actually, I won't get into it, but at some point, Croatia and Serbia were fighting Bosnia. That's another story. But just at this point in 91, these two breakaway states, I guess, had voted for independence. So in March of 92, Bosnians voted for their own independence. Most Serbs in Bosnia, and you saw the statistics, the demographics before, most Serbs in Bosnia voted against the referendum for independence. But there was roughly a quarter to a third of Serbs who voted for it. They saw that independence, was okay. They did not want to be part of Yugoslavia and part of what was social democracy. It was originally communist from 1945 to late 1980s under President Tito. But they saw, what was going on in sort of the Soviet bloc, I guess, and in Yugoslavia, said people wanted independence. In March of 92, when Bosnia voted for independence, that really, and meanwhile, the wars are going on mostly in Croatia, briefly in Slovenia. Milosevic, there's a seminal speech in 1989 in Kosovo, where in fact, it was commemorating 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. So in 1389, there was a battle where the Ottoman Empire defeated Serbia. Now Milosevic went to this statue in this field of Kosovo where the battle took place, and there are roughly 1 million ethnic Serbs from Kosovo and other areas in the Balkans that attended his speech. And he is whipping up a frenzy of nationalism and ultranationalism. This is where he's talking about the Ottoman Empire, and the Turks, and we need to get revenge on the Muslims. It even dates back to this 1389. And there are other incidents that happen along the way. But he gives this speech in 1989 and sort of seals the deal for in the coming years, what is going to be going on, because he is calling for something that Serbia had wanted forever, really, for centuries, to create a greater Serbia, a pure Serbia, pure Orthodox Christian Serbia. So when this is all going on and things are starting to heat up over the next couple of years, so in 1992, when Bosnia voted for independence, the plans were already in place. And there was a Bosnian Serb army that was being provided military equipment from the Yugoslav People's Army. Secretly, that was happening. And this army is ready to invade. And on April 7th, they invade Bosnia. Small towns in Bosnia, places like what are called Visegrad and Foča and other places, and Sarajevo. And maybe some of you have heard of the siege of Sarajevo. It's the longest period of shelling and bombing of a city in Europe ever. And it went on for almost 4 years. But all this is happening. April 7th, they invade in Prijedor, which is where my book focuses. In early to mid-May, the Bosnian Serb army, and these are ultra-nationalists, they invade, they take over government buildings, they take over the police, they take over post office, and they fire anyone who is Muslim or Catholic Croat. They ensure that they can no longer receive a paycheck, they send them home from their jobs, et cetera, and things are really getting quite worrisome. And not only that, maybe more that, the Bosnian Serb army in the smaller villages and in Prijedor, which is a kind of like our county, it's a municipality. Prijedor was the largest city, about 50,000 people. They begin to kill, slaughter many of the people there, many of the innocent people there and in other surrounding towns. They also capture men and boys of fighting age, and they put them in concentration camps, and they capture women and girls and put them in concentration camps, and some of them become rape camps, and some are certainly subject to sexual abuse and rape. But this is all going on. Meanwhile, the people in Bosnia, there was no army at the time. When they established independence, there was no army. But meanwhile, the people in Bosnia, they had been neighbors and friends. Some of the, there was a large intermarriage before all this happened of the different ethnicities. So they were, many of the people I've spoken to, survivors, that said we were very naive. We didn't see this coming. And then we were overrun. So the concentration camps in Prijedor municipality that were set up are, you can see on the screen, Omarska, Karaterm, Ternopolje, and Manjača was outside of Prijedor. But these are primary places for the first part of my book where, a lot of the scenes take place. And these are brutal. And you can see in the picture on this screen, this is Omarska. The building in the back was an iron ore mining company that was not functional a few months or a year before the war, and it was turned into a concentration camp. The building in the front was known as the White House, and the White House was notorious for a place of torture, and many times people coming from the larger building, and by the way, there were horrible conditions. I mean, these people, they're sleeping on the floor, they're crowded. Sometimes people are dying because there's no room to breathe, literally, and they're being fed one meal a day of soup and beans, 3 beans, that's about it. But anyway, oftentimes when people went to the White House, they didn't return. Karaterm was a ceramics factory outside of the city of Prijedor that was also not functional, but it was turned into a very brutal concentration camp. Ternopolje is the name actually of a village in the Prijedor municipality that within which had a primary school that was turned into a concentration camp. And in that one, many women and children were housed, but there were certainly many men and boys, and they were typically sleeping outside. The men and boys were in the yard. And Manjača was a prisoner of war camp. It actually was a training facility for the Yugoslav People's Army earlier on, but it was turned into a prisoner of war camp and actually concentration camp. And I put this quote, there's a guy who wrote this, Hikmet Karčić, who wrote sort of a historical piece from my book, the And Still We Rise book. And he recently wrote a book, very recently, it just came out last week, called Torture, Humiliation, Kill Inside the Bosnian Serb Camp System. And he said the primary aspects of the collective traumatization in these camps were torture, sexual abuse, humiliation, and killings. And he sees the concentration camps, as a way of instilling fear and trauma to make sure that Bosniaks and Catholic Croats left Bosnia and never returned, so the Serbs could expand and have their greater Serbia. Okay, so this is just a picture of prisoners inside Manjača concentration camp, and where they're sitting, there were 2 buildings, 3 stalls each, where cows were housed. But during much of the time the prisoners were there, the cows were out in the pastures, so they didn't come into the building, but where these guys are sitting is where they slept. Okay, and this is my friend, Satko Mijojic. Are you able, you know what, are you guys, I just realized, hopefully you're able to see, I see a little band over the titles. Are you able to see that, Jenna?
Yeah, we can see everything. Yeah.
That's good. Okay, so I'm the one seeing that band. Anyway, Sakura wrote the foreword for my book, And Still We Rise, and he's in front of the White House, as you could see. He spent almost 7 months in both Omarska and Manjača. He was 20 at the time. And I found him on, he did a YouTube interview because I was doing lots of research for the book and I wanted to learn about Prijedor because I did not know much about it. I didn't know a whole lot about the war, what I consider the genocide. Satko and I had several months of Zoom calls. He lived in both Brussels and Sweden. And he certainly experienced torture. He was there at Omarska, at least with his father, and he told me numerous stories. He was very open about what happened to him in the camps. this is probably 6 years ago or 7 years ago, every August 6th, which is when the concentration camps in Prijedor closed for the most part because a British news team discovered them. They were being concealed, and the world, exposed this, and the world had to condemn the camps, of course. So they were closed roughly August 6th, and every August 6th, there's a commemoration at Omarska, and 1,000 balloons or white balloons are let go, and they're only allowed a 4-hour commemoration. A small plaque is put up in the window of the White House, and the reason being is because Prijedor is in now what's called Republika Srpska, and I mentioned that before, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about how Republika Srpska came about. But this is Satko in front of the White House, and he goes pretty much every year to be part of the commemoration. Okay, so the war itself, because the Bosnian army finally, there was a resistance in Sarajevo and other places, and there was finally an army that formed, and it really was a war. But in the meantime, you have a system of concentration camps throughout Bosnia. You have these small villages, especially, being assaulted and people being slaughtered. There was, I don't know if you guys have heard of the genocide at Srebrenica. It's the only war crime considered by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague. It's the only war crime considered legally to be a genocide, where 8,372 men and boys were slaughtered and put in mass graves. That happened in July of 1995. And I think finally, when this became known, this horrific genocide and how it all went down, the US brokered what was called the Dayton Peace Accords, and that was in December of 95. So here are, on the left is President Izetbegovic of Bosnia, and on the right is Milosevic, the evil Milosevic, who really, was at the helm, but there were other actors in this for sure. In fact, Milosevic was indicted for genocide, as was the general Ratko Mladic was his name. He was actually convicted for genocide, the crime of genocide, and so was Radovan Karadzic, who was the political leader of the Bosnian Serbs. When Milosevic was in prison awaiting his sentence in 2006, he died of a heart attack. So he unfortunately didn't get to serve much time in prison. But the Dayton Peace Accords, unfortunately, it did stop the war, which is, of course, necessary, but it, in a sense, rewarded the nationalist, and I call, and it's not an original term, genocidaires, those who were responsible for, and I think Prijedor was a genocide, Foča was a genocide. There were many genocides, I believe, within Bosnia perpetrated by the Bosnian Serbs. Where was I in this? The peace accords set up Republika Srpska, and in a sense rewarded, as I said, the genocidaires. So now 49% of Bosnia and Herzegovina belong to Republika Srpska, and 51% to what was called, to mostly the Bosniaks and Croats. And those three constituent groups make up to this day a tripartite presidency, which leaves out, quote unquote, the others who do not have the same rights, even though there's a European Court of Human Rights that has time and time again said you can't discriminate. Dayton kind of set this up so that you have this tripartite government. You have Republika Srpska. They did create something called the Office of the High Representative, which does oversee Dayton and to ensure that at least some of the other, the articles are followed. But then you have now today, there is a crisis today in Bosnia where the head of Republika Srpska, of that party, wants to secede from Bosnia, and military police over the years in Republika Srpska have been trained by Russia. Russia is very involved in this. There's now a great uptick in fear because of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, that their ally in Republika Srpska, whose name is Milorad Dodik, that there could be some, there's definitely concern about military action again in Bosnia. But Dayton also set up this tremendous ethnic division, ethno-religious division in Bosnia. In the schools, for example, in Republika Srpska, first of all, right now there's a tremendous amount of denial, genocide denial on the part of Milorad Dodik, the leader of Republika Srpska, and many people in Republika Srpska and Serbia itself, and they still have this notion of connecting Republika Srpska with Serbia and trying to dissolve Bosnia. That still exists. But even the kids growing up in Republika Srpska, their textbooks talk about that general I mentioned, Mladic, as a war hero. There's no mention of the atrocities, no mention of the genocide in Srebrenica, no mention of the concentration camps, no commemoration within Republika Srpska. It's frowned upon greatly. Excuse me, there are even there are billboards of Mladic in certain parts of Republika Srpska. So you can imagine those who returned, those Bosniaks and Croats, particularly Bosniaks who returned to Republika Srpska, they're faced with not only psychological intimidation, they just want to go back to their homes, but also the threat of physical harm. So that's what, unfortunately, Dayton unleashed. Now, in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is what Republika Srpska is to be a part of, it's not a separate, it can't be a separate country. Their history more reflects the accuracy of the horrors that went on. Okay, so this is the ICTY I mentioned. That's where the tribunal, really tried the architects of this genocidal campaign, and it lasted that long. You can see 2003 to 2017, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of documents, witnesses that came forth. It's very touching. I've read the proceedings. I've seen videos of people who lost so many in the genocides testifying. And so 62, I think it's 62 Serb architects of this were convicted, 29 Croats, and I think 5 Bosniaks, because there was atrocities on both sides, but not anywhere to the degree that was perpetrated by the Serbs. And this is, the human cost. So this is a cemetery. There's a museum, kind of like the Holocaust Museum, called the Srebrenica Memorial Center. And every July, those remains, because there are no whole bodies remaining, but those remains that are discovered, and there's still probably 1,000 or so that have not been found yet. Those remains every July are buried in a ceremony at the Srebrenica Memorial Center, and these are the stones that exist in here. 2 women who are praying at the gravesite, I guess, of one of their loved ones. But the reason I always refer to this as genocide, because there were 25 to 35,000 civilians, Bosniak civilians, who were murdered. And there were upwards of 50,000 women and girls raped. 1,000 religious sites were destroyed. Really, a couple million people were displaced. Right now, we have in the diaspora around the world, but here in the US, there are about 300,000 Bosniaks who moved here eventually after the war, they got here. And in my book, the protagonists that I'll talk more about them later, but they do end up settling in Utica, New York. And I can tell you later why Utica, New York. But the human costs are something that we always have to be aware of. Now, this is just a map showing you Republika Srpska. You could see it better. And it is, like I said, there's tremendous division on so many levels between these 2 places. Okay, so what I see is I'm doing my part to give voice to the truth. And many people that I've interviewed and spoken with thank me. And again, it's not about me, believe me, and I don't even need the thanks. But the reason they're doing that is because of the denial that is so strong in Republika Srpska and Serbia. White supremacist groups are actually, many of them sort of follow the dogma of the nationalists in Serbia. But so many people say, we need our stories to be told. We thank you for telling our stories. So that's a big motivator for my book. So I don't know how, wow, did I talk that long? I do apologize. I'm going to really reduce that. Can you see me now?
Yep, we can see you.
I apologize. Boy, did I get into that. That was 45 minutes. I will reduce that. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't go too far, but yeah. So let me answer questions if I may.
Sure. So far, we don't have any questions from the audience.
Okay.
Nicole did mention, I think during the beginning of the presentation, that she had always found it difficult to get a grasp of the ethnic makeup of the region. So I think you helped break that down. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I guess to start us off, I guess what inspired you to write about the atrocities in Bosnia?
A few years ago, I was very, I think as many of us were, not happy with the immigration policy in this company. I was teaching at Hoover Middle School, Hoover Community School in Redwood City. That was the last year I was teaching middle school. Most of the kids there were from Mexican and Central American families, and they were very, very worried about their parents being visited by ICE and deported. I thought about my own family history, that my grandparents escaped Eastern Europe, actually in Ukraine area, because of pogroms. Jews were being persecuted and worse. My wife emigrated from Italy in the early 60s because they were seeking economic opportunity. And I thought about those things and I said, we should not be demonizing, as at that point, former president was, demonizing Muslims, demonizing people coming across our southern border. So I interviewed 14 people for this book called Our Neighbors, Their Voices, True Stories of Immigrant Exodus, and included people from Lebanon, India, Mexico, Guatemala, Cyprus, Ethiopia. And I interviewed 2 women who were children at the time of the war in Bosnia. And I was blown away because I just didn't know much about it. And it just touched me to a point where I learned enough about these women that I said, I need to write another book specifically about what happened in Bosnia, because I didn't know a lot about it, and I'm not sure a lot of people knew a lot about it. So it kind of, it began a journey for me that has taken me to today. So writing that book really stemmed from the first book. And to be honest, I mean, I had been a social worker before for many years. I was in nonprofit. I'd been a middle school teacher, I said, for 13 years. Never knew I was going to be a writer. I don't know if I am still, but it's been a really wonderful journey for me. And I've met many, many people who've opened up their hearts to me, speaking to me about their experiences. And part of that, I told you about Satko, but I did a lot of research, and it came to me to write this novel. I will tell you, Satko wrote the foreword, and it's a really wonderful foreword. When we first started to meet, he said, I will not promote your book. I'm not going to advocate for your book unless you write as close to the truth as possible. You are non-Bosnian. You don't have the same experience. Anyway, he was, I was very open. I wanted to learn from him what he had experienced, and that I was able to put into the book, where he did eventually not only said he'd promote it and support it, but he'd write the foreword. And he's the one who kind of he said something like, this is the best truth-based fiction about the concentration camps in Bosnia ever written, which is really pretty flattering. But I've used the term truth-based fiction ever since. I mean, many consider historical fiction, but like I said, things have evolved both in terms of my writing and advocacy, because I've become a very strong advocate, as you can see from what I presented. There is a crisis continuing in Bosnia today, and the threat of war again.
There's a comment and a question. The war, just so shocked to witness a hot war in Ukraine. People ask how it could happen. Did we forget about this war? And how are the survivors of this war feeling about the war in Ukraine?
So I'm sorry, the first part of the question is that we comment more forgetting about the war in Bosnia? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, I've heard from numerous people who are re-traumatized by what's going on in Ukraine. I helped to write an op-ed recently that connects the two, because as I said, there is real fear that because in Republika Srpska, they not only ally with Russia, and Milorad Dodik, the one person I mentioned, the politician I mentioned, has met with Putin recently in the last few months. Russia has trained the military police in Republika Srpska, and they're really not supposed to be any sort of military according to the Dayton Peace Accords. There are also these gangs and militias similar to the horrific gangs, because there were criminal gangs used by Serbia and the Bosnian Serbs in the war in the early 90s. There are criminal gangs that are out of Serbia and Republika Srpska that are fighting now in Ukraine on behalf of Russia. So the connection between Russia and the Balkans and Russia, Serbia is the only country that did not condemn the Russian invasion. So we're really at a real difficult point here that has been accelerated by the invasion in Ukraine.
I guess as a follow-up, they asked us, say more about the threat of new war in Bosnia. Do you think, rather than just as unrest, do you think there's a chance of new war in Bosnia?
There is, and that's one of the concerns. And again, it was in the past, Russia sort of quietly did what they were doing behind the scenes, and they quietly supported Milorad Dodik to secede from Bosnia, which they can't, according to Dayton. But now it's become, I don't think people expected the aggression by Putin. And so now there is real worry that, well, if he could do that in Ukraine, even if Russia's military doesn't invade Bosnia, they could do so by proxy, because Republika Srpska has military equipment, including war, helicopters, military helicopters. They have these military police that have been trained. They have other weaponry. And so there is fear. There really is fear about that. So the US and the West have to step up in support of Bosnia, which they didn't do. Dayton was not really in support of Bosnia. They really, for 3 years, allowed the concentration camps, allowed the war. There was an arms embargo that Bosnia was not able to purchase weapons even from the West. So they really did nothing, and unfortunately promoted the idea that this is longstanding civil war. This is back in the 90s, that those Muslims, those Serbs, those Croats, they've been fighting for centuries. So why are we going to get involved? It's not an important strategic location. Of course, that was not the case. It was not the case at all. There was not centuries of fighting. And they really, when you look at it now, there is very much a strategic location, because you now have, like I said, Russia has been very much involved. Serbia, Hungary is very involved in supporting Republika Srpska. So it really is a strategic position. And the US and the West has to step up on behalf of Bosnia.
There's another comment and question in the chat. Very interesting, Jordan, thank you. I don't know much about the war and genocide, unfortunately. How did you approach such a complicated subject and distill it into a readable book?
Very good question. Prior, like I said, I spoke with Satko for many months. I did lots of research, including reading other books. I read a memoir from a man who was in Omarska and Manjača. In fact, he and Satko know each other. it was important to me. I think part of it is having been a social worker, having been a teacher and working with kids who, we used to have this, there still is a term in education called trauma-informed teaching. Because I knew those kids, in the neighborhood near Costco in Redwood City, I remember we had a police officer come in and talk to the teachers. There are 5 gangs in the neighborhoods. And these kids, and not just about the gangs, but, any kids anywhere in the country, as a teacher, you can't just look at them as just your student. These are whole people who have their own issues coming in. So I think I've always approached whatever it is I've done from a perspective of empathy. And so when I'm reading about this and learning about what happened and learning about the genocide, and also knowing, I only very much, actually recently, from a friend of my mother's, my parents are deceased, she told me that when they were teenagers, my mother learned by letter from some relatives in Europe that we had lost family in the Holocaust concentration camps. I never knew that. My parents didn't talk about it. So, there's certainly a thread of my understanding about trauma, my understanding about genocide and the Holocaust. I was brought up, it's not something we shied away from, but talked about. But I think it was important to humanize the characters in my book, that these are real people. These are people, in fact, a third book I'm writing, where I've interviewed a number of survivors, is just going to be their stories. These are people who had celebrations like we do. They had ups, they had downs, they went to school, they played sports, they went to movie theaters, restaurants, parties. It's kind of like, I think we're seeing that a lot in Ukraine now, which has not been exposed prior. So these are human beings who we can relate to. We do and did the same things. And I think that's part of why what I'm able to write, particularly later on in the book, as they leave, the family members, protagonists, as they leave the concentration camps, they're trying to find a sense of balance. They end up, most of them leave the concentration camps, they go to Croatia, and it's pretty unsettling because there's a lot of strife nearby. They end up going to Germany. They think that's their permanent home, but they ultimately end up in Utica, New York, which is where my wife ended up. Her family in the early 60s ended up emigrating to. So I know Utica very well. I've been going there many, many years. And there's a large Bosnian population there. And the 2 women I interviewed for the first book both live in Utica. So, so I think just humanizing the experience of I suppose certainly with war, but how do any of us find a sense of balance from any kind of trauma we experience? And that's how I wanted the second part of the book to, I wanted the characters to be able to search for that, and for the most part, find it.
Different question. Is there a local Bosniak population, and how has the book been received?
There is, I think San Jose and San Francisco have a larger, I don't know how many, but have larger Bosniak populations. But the St. Louis and Chicago actually have the large, I think in St. Louis, there are 60,000 Bosniaks. In Utica, for example, there are 6,000, which is still pretty large. Utica is a city of 50,000. There's a surrounding area that has many more thousands. And I went to, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Utica doing a book tour. And it was fun. I went to different places live. They don't wear masks in Utica, but that's another issue. But it was live, and I had really, really lovely experience. The last night was a gala where they were commemorating the 30th anniversary of independence, Bosnia's independence, and they had these teenagers doing in traditional garb, doing dance, traditional dances, and they had songs, and the food is amazing, and it's a very communal experience. And I've gotten a sense that in many communities that have large Bosnian populations, it's mostly a pretty tight-knit community. In terms of the book being how it's been received, I think pretty well. I don't know how many books I've sold, which is kind of interesting. because of some issue with the publisher. Hopefully that'll get resolved. April's tomorrow, right? Yeah, hopefully that gets resolved. But to me, honestly, I mean, I do want to sell books. My goal was to donate to an organization, and the proceeds to donate to an organization in Bosnia. I'm not at that point yet. I don't know how many have sold, but aside from the sales, I've gotten a lot of positive feedback. I will tell you, including my wife and others I know I'm obviously close with. They said, it's a very intense book, particularly in the concentration camps. It's a tough read because there were tough things that went on, difficult things. But after you get past, it's like chapter 10 or 11 or something, I think there are 30 chapters or whatever, it becomes more of sort of this, you can breathe again and say, okay, wow, that was intense. And now you get to the more kind of humanizing experiences. So honestly, I think it's been very well received by people who've read it. I've had very positive comments.
And this might be a long answer. It's 3 questions. What's the hope for Bosnia currently? What's the solution to push for now? And is there a workable solution possible given the current situation?
Well, I mean, the hope, see, here's one of the problems. Like I said, Dayton stopped the war, the peace accord stopped the war, but they set up this unmanageable tripartite government where it's become ethnically divided. So you have this Dodik, who's the Bosnian Serb, Orthodox Christian. You have this other a Catholic Croat who's actually pretty sympathetic to peace and justice, but Dodik is obviously not. And then you have the Bosniak representative. But until that, and they really, one of the things, I'm in this group called the Working Group for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there are people in Europe and people here, and these people are really, really smart, and they really know their stuff, and I've learned so much from them. And the goal for that group is advocating for a true democracy and for all citizens of Bosnia to be given equal rights. Because right now, only those 3 constituent groups can actually even run for office. So if you're Jewish or Roma, or you don't identify, you cannot run for office. So the hope is really to incorporate those changes that Dayton did not do. But then you have the likes of Dodik and others, who they don't want changes because they have a great deal of power now. So that has to happen. There's a move for electoral reform, which is actually really very bad for Bosnia. And unfortunately, the US is supporting this electoral reform, which would provide also very nationalistic, smaller Croat party with much more power. And they also align with the Republika Srpska. So this electoral reform that's being pushed is very bad for the country. And we're not, like in this advocacy group, we're not sure why is the US didn't get it in the early 90s. What are they not getting now? So part of advocacy is reaching out to government and elected officials to say, this is not going to work. We think that because of the invasion in Ukraine and the solidarity amongst most Western European countries and the US, that perhaps they're going to be wiser about how they approach Bosnia.
Oh, I was right about to ask that question, so thank you in the chat. Very interesting topic. What's your next book about?
I have, well, for one, I mentioned it a little before about, I've interviewed so far 13 survivors who live in the diaspora here in the US. And these are survivors from different parts of Bosnia and with different experiences. Again, wanting to humanize and tell their stories, give voice to truth, as I say. And part of it is, when I'm interviewing these folks, it's tell me what your life was like before the war, before the genocide, and they're telling me about their education, their schooling and kids they played with and parties they went to, and, sort of the interaction between the religious groups and ethnicity. It was not, there was not strife between the 3. It was manufactured by the rhetoric and hate. But really just to help people understand, like I said before, that could be us, right? But then they're telling their stories, and these are really very powerful stories about what they experienced in the war. And for most of the people, it just changed like that, because again, they were friends with their Serb neighbors. Some of their Serb neighbors were godparents to these Bosniak kids. So it happened in such a way that it was, I wouldn't say it was suddenly, because things were happening, but many of the people I've interviewed said we were naive. We didn't see what was going on. But I'm telling their stories because they're very powerful. And again, the people here at this talk say, well, we didn't know much about the genocide and we don't know what it was, what was it like? I think you find it very interesting. What was it like? But then subsequent to that is what has it been like in their journey here in the States? How have they, in a sense, triumphed over the hate by their resilience? So that's what I'm doing. The other thing I have in that book, it's almost done. I have 7 young adults who grew up with parents who survived the war, the genocide. And so I'm interested in the intergenerational transmission of those experiences, because you can't parent a child and not have those experiences inform you in some sense. So I've had these, to me, they're kids or early 20s, write some incredibly beautiful reflections about their lives. Some of them said, I've never really expressed this to my parents. And I gave them sort of very broad parameters. I'm not going to interview them. I just said, here are the parameters. And they've really written some beautiful things. So that is, those 2 components are in the next book. I also I've gotten photographs. Many of the people, the survivors, sent me photographs, but many have also told me we don't have any. We had to leave our homes quickly. I got one from a friend in Australia, or, my cousin and so had some. So they don't have that many, but I'm including photographs, particularly what their lives were like before the war. Yeah.
And it looks like there are no other questions. Was anything you wanted to end on?
I don't think so. I said a lot, probably too much. I would appreciate if you, certainly support the cause. Purchase the book. You can get it at Amazon or Barnes and Noble. I did a book signing at, it's called Books Inc. in Palo Alto back in the fall. I love indie bookstores. Of course, I'd prefer not to support Amazon and Barnes and Noble, but that's where the books are as well. But you can order a book from your independent bookstore. My website, jordanstevensher.com. It's JORDANSTEVENSHER.com. So you can see some of the other things I've done, and you can even order the book online. But I really do appreciate you guys being here this evening and listening to me.